It should be here.
Okay, well, welcome back to Hebrew Story Hour. We're in Genesis 16, and if you've been regular, that's great. You'll see hopefully see some connections. We've read 12 and 13 and 15, and 16 and 17 are potentially well, they're up next. We'll see. I think we're actually just looking ahead before I forget. We'll just continue on. If we don't get to 17 or all through 17, we'll pick up where we leave off. But 18 and 19 are also really good stories. So continue on where we leave off. Okay, everybody ready? Okay. Well, may the Lord bless the reading of his word, Genesis 16. Visarai Eshet Avram lo Yalada lo. Vela Shifcha Mitzrit Ushama Hagar. Verse 2. Vatomer Sarai El Avram. Hine na atzarani Adonai miledet bo na el shifchati ulai ibaneh mimena. Vayishma Avram l'kol Sarai. Verse 3. Vatikach Sarai eshet Avram et Hagar hamitzrit shifchata. Mekates Eser Shanim Leshevet Avram Be'eretz Canaan Vatitain Ota LaAvram Isha Lo LaIsha. Okay, we'll pause there and go back in and translate, starting verse 1. Now, so it doesn't start with a Bayaktol, so introductory sentences. Now Sarai, the wife of Avram, had not given birth for him, but she had a maidservant, or an Egyptian maidservant, and her name was Hagar. Verse 2, and Sarai said to Avram, look, Yahweh has restrained me from bearing a child, or from giving birth. Enter into my maidservant, perhaps I will be built from her. So imperfect nifal ibaneh. And Avram listened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, the wife of Avram, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maidservant, at the end of 10 years of the dwelling of Avram in the land of Canaan. And she gave her to Avram, her husband, to him as a wife, as an Isha. All right, verse 4. If you haven't been with us before, I'm just going to read and translate through a whole chapter, and then we'll pause and have some conversation. Verse 4. Vayavo el Hagar vatahar vatere ki harata vatekal givirta be'eneha. Verse 5. Vatomer Sarai el Avram, Chamasi alecha anochi, natati shifchati v'chekecha, vatere ki harata, va'akal be'eneha, yishpot Adonai beini uvenecha. Verse 6. Vayomer Avram el Sarai, Hine shifchatech biyadech, asi la hatov be'enayech, Vata'aneha Sarai Vativrach Mipaneha. Okay, pausing there and going back to verse 4. And he entered into Hagar, and she became pregnant. And she saw that she was pregnant, and her mistress was slighted in her eyes. So that phrase, let me just pause. Kalal can be to curse, although it's also can be made light of. And so the subject of this is Givirta, her mistress. In any case, it's a call, Vayiktol, Vatekal, but it might be tempting to take this as she slighted her mistress in her eyes, but the subject is Givirta. As we'll see in verse 5, it comes up again. And Sarai said to Avram, my violence, or violence done against me, or my being wronged, be upon you. As for me, I gave my maidservant into your lap. And she saw that she became pregnant, and I was slighted in her eyes. May the Lord judge, Joseph Yishpot, may the Lord judge between me and you. Verse 6, and Avram said to Sarai, look, she's your maidservant, or actually no, your maidservant is in your hand. Do to her what is right or what is good in your eyes. And she oppressed her, or she made her submit, Sarai made her submit, and she fled away from her. The subject switches there to Hagar. Okay, verse 7. Vayimtsa'a malach Adonai al ein hamayim bamidbar al ha'ayin b'derech shur. Vayomer Hagar shifchat Sarai e mizeh bat ba'ana telechi. Vatomer mipnei Sarai givirti anochi borachat. Verse 9. Vayomer la malach Adonai shuvi el givirtech behit ani tachat yadeha. Verse 10. Vayomer la malach Adonai harba arbe et zarech velo yisafer meirov. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. So going back to verse 7. And an angel of the Lord found her beside the spring of water in the wilderness. Beside the spring by the road to Shur, the road of Shur. And Hagar, and he said, Hagar, maidservant of Sarai, from where are you going? Where from this place have you come? And where, Anna, different word for the same English translation, essentially, where are you going? And she said, away from Sarai, my mistress, I am fleeing. Now, verse 9, and she said to her, or rather, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hands. And he said to her, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will certainly multiply your seed, or your offspring, and he will not be counted from a multitude. And the men there is probably comparative. In comparison to a multitude, your offspring won't even be able to be counted. So even more than a multitude, a rove. Okay, verse 11. Vayomer la malach Adonai, hinach hara vayolad bain, bakarat shemo Yishmael, ki shama Adonai el onyech, vahu yihyeh hera Adam, yado vakol, vayad kol bo, ba'al panei chol echav yishkon. We're going to read to the end of the chapter, so bear with me. Verse 13. Va'tikra shem Adonai hadover elecha ata el roi, ki amara hagam halom ra'iti acharei roi. Verse 14. Al kain kara la ba'er lachai roi, hine vein kadesh uvein bared. Vateled Hagar la Avram bain. Vayikra Avram Shem beno asher yalada Hagar Yishmael. And finally, verse 16. Avram ben Shimonim Shana v'shesh shanim beledet Hagar et Yishmael Avram. Okay, so there's quite a bit here, all the way back to verse 11 in translation. And the angel of the Lord said to her, it's hine plus the 2fs, so look, you have become pregnant, and you will bear a son, and you will call his name Yishmael, because Yahweh has heard or has listened to your oppression, your oni. And he will be a wild ass of a man. A para is, a chamor is a domesticated donkey. A para is a wild donkey. And his hand will be against all, and the hand of all or everyone else will be against him. And another different way of saying against the face of all of his kin, he will reside. Okay, and she called the name of Yahweh, the one who spoke to her. You are El Roi, which means God. It's either God of appearance. We can come back to this. It may be a text critical. We want to change this to God who sees me, or it could be God of my seeing. And I like the last option, God of my seeing. For she said, then we have an interrogative, hey, is it even here that I have seen after my seeing? Let me finish translating and then we'll come back to that phrase. Therefore he called the well, or the Ba'er Lachai Roi. So it's a proper name, which means the well of the living one who sees me. So in that case, it would be not Hagar's seeing, but the one who sees Hagar. And this is a strange hine, but it is look or behold. It's between Kadesh and Bared, so two place names. And Hagar gave birth for Abraham, or birthed to a son for Abraham, or Avram still. And Avram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Yishmael. And now Avram was, and we have a number, Shimonim is 80, Shana, so 80 years, and Shesh Shanim, 6 years, so 86 years old. When Hagar gave birth, so it's an infinitive construct, so in the giving birth of Hagar, so Hagar is giving birth to Yishmael for Avram. Okay, thus ends chapter 16. So I definitely want to talk about sort of the name of God here, but maybe anything before we get to verse 14, what questions, then questions can range from parsing, grammar questions to more theological questions. What observations or questions do you have in this story?
Do you think there's an intentional link between what happens here and what happens with Abraham later on in chapter 22, when he says the Lord will see to it? I think there's an interesting sharing of vocabulary there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Yahweh Yireh there, Yahweh will see to it. Or usually English translations are Yahweh will provide. But I like the see to it because it connects. And in that case, God, it's the Yahweh is the subject of the verb. That's sometimes that is popularized as Jehovah Jireh. I've heard that. Have you ever heard that phrase? Right. So it's Yahweh Yireh, but either way, it's God looking upon Avram. That's in the Binding of Isaac story. So certainly a connection between this story and that one. It's a good observation. We can ask other questions, but let's just talk about, since that comes up. So we have like in verse 13, Ro'i with the Chatef comets, the compound comets there, is a noun meaning like appearance, the God of appearance. So this is Hagar naming Yahweh, the one who spoke to her, as El, which is God, Ro'i. So it's a name, El Ro'i. So if you have your BHS and you look at the bottom, the first note takes, and the Septuagint, so God makes God the subject, the God who sees me, which the only really modification we'd have to make is it would be a long O vowel above the resh, so it would be a participle, which then it could be my seeing or seeing me. In other words, there's an issue of whether she's naming God because she's seen God in this place, or whether God has seen her. It's clarified a bit in not the next phrase. Well, maybe perhaps if there may be some text critical, some problem here, but you have the way it is, Halom is here in this place, right? I have seen, so then it's about Hagar seeing, even after Ro'i, my seeing. So one way of making sense of this is that she's lived through the experience of seeing God. And so she continues to see even after seeing God, which would make sense of her naming the well, the Be'er, as Be'er Lachai, the living God. So the well of the living God of my seeing. So basically, or it could have to do with continuing living on. It's confusing, I think. And if you look at all the text critical notes in verse 13, where it says, with MT has halom ra'iti acharei ro'i. If you look down at the bottom, verse 13b and C, you'll see all sorts of, the first note, B, is there's no manuscript evidence for this, but they think there's a mistake. and that Shalom should be rather Elohim. So God, and then they have God has seen after my seeing. So again, there's no manuscript evidence for that. I'm just walking you through they're hypothesizing on the basis of this being just kind of convoluted, trying to come up with, to make sense of it.
Yeah, I was looking at the two times that you see ro'i in my page. They're like almost right on top of each other, line for line, in 13 and 14. And the vowels around look different. And I can't name them all because I'm brand spanking new at this, but I know that they look different just looking at them, like the resh. I believe that chametz has a T sort of appearance to it.
Yes.
Is the other two dots vertically a sego?
Yeah, so that is what we call, there's a couple of different names for it, like a chatef vowel, a half vowel. It's with guttural letters, you get these shavas that are it's not just straight up vocal shava, but it's like a comet shava, might think of it that way. So whereas it's a short U class vowel, it's ro'i, but it's not the cholam that you see on the next verb. So it really is, with the chatef vowel, it's a noun meaning the God of appearance. Whereas with the cholam, it's a participle, my seeing, or it could be seeing me.
So it changes not necessarily how you say the word, but what the word means.
It does change the meaning of the word. It's
okay.
There's probably some vocal difference. The shorter vowel, it's ro'i, it's a little shorter compared to ro'i.
I see.
But actually, the accent is the same. So ro'i and ro'i, it basically sounds the same, at least the way that I would say.
So then it would be essentially strictly contextual basis that you would try to figure out what it would mean, because if my understanding is right, the vowels, symbols, and such didn't come along till much later.
Yeah, so what the Masoretes are doing when they put the vowel markers in, they are preserving a historical reading, the way that they know to say it, and the way that coordinates with what they know it to mean. So yeah, you're right, but this is when we emend the text by just changing a vowel, it's really not an emendation because you're not changing the consonants. So it's not a stretch by any means to say that what this should be is the participle, my seeing, rather than the noun, which is what especially here in this one, you have text critical evidence that it's a participle. If you look down on note 13a, I like this stuff. I hope this is entertaining or interesting to you. You have these three squiggly lines, like loop-de-loops. That's this mark for the Samaritan Pentateuch. So they have ra'ah with a hey, which would be like a perfect God has seen. And then you have the next mark. That's the marker for the Septuagint. And then in brackets, the V, which is the Vulgate. So the Greek translation and the Latin translation have the participle. The Greek is ha epidon me. So the participle, one who sees me. So the Septuagint understands this as a participle, even though the Masoretes are pointing it like a noun. So there's text critical evidence to say, this should be a long O, like one who sees me.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, theologically, I think this is really important. And this is back to Adrian's comment that you have this identity of Yahweh as watching and observing. and acting. Like it's not just a passive, like he's looked upon me, but there's like God has acted on my behalf. Although I don't know if it, when I read this, I was like, man, God just sends her right back into affliction, to oppression. That's a little bothersome to me. But then but there's also this blessing that's given for Ishmael, and for Hagar. So one of the issues here, like how Hagar looks down upon Sarai after she sees that she's pregnant. This is all having to do, and we'll see this in all of these childbearing narratives, where it's status is really like the main issue, where even Sarai says, I will be built up through her. In other words, she will have like her own status would be built, and perhaps like, her lineage, her own identity would carry on through the children that would be born. That's relating to like what makes for a good life when you have children who remember you, and who will tell your stories and so on. That's why Sarai seems to be inferring about this child. But then Hagar's status is elevated by becoming a wife of Avram and bearing a child. And so whether she slights this is probably what the meaning of being slighted or looking with contempt upon Sarai is, just that, oh, I'm no longer simply your servant. Like I'm elevated in status, and that seems to really bother Sarai. So she makes her submit. So you have all this kind of status back and forth. It was really the main issue for Sarai and Hagar. And the blessing of Yahweh that her child would be blessed and be multiplied is saying God's going to preserve your status, even though you might be experiencing this affliction. Yes, Kelly.
So just in hearing it, is there a link between the word for angel and the word for king?
No, but you're right to hear it, because Melech and Malach. So Melech, the difference is an aleph. It does sound like it, but Malach has Mem Lamed Aleph Kaf. And of course, Melech doesn't have the aleph in there. So it's really a different word. There's not, as far as I'm aware, any kind of original meaningful link between those words. It is important in this story that you have the angel of the Lord character, because that character is going to show up throughout the patriarchal narratives. And Hagar's experience, she has seen the Lord, the God, she's seen God. So the angel of the Lord is essentially synonymous with Yahweh, not just a servant of Yahweh, but Yahweh himself. Will?
So I have not looked at Hebrew in a while, and it has become evident through sitting here, but this is a fun way to kind of relearn it little bit by little bit.
Good.
What I found interesting was the repeating imagery of eyes or seeing. The good thing about biblical languages is it forces you to pay more attention,
right,
to stories, to every little detail in a sentence. Whereas in English, especially if it's something you've kind of heard before, we have a tendency to gloss over, skip really fast to the point we're trying to make. But I never noticed how much, words for eyes or seeing are brought up in this chapter, and how that sort of drives the narrative, I think. Sarai, did what was right in her eyes.
Yeah.
And it results in something, from our perspective, kind of wicked. But then God does what's right in his eyes, and ends up blessing her. I also have sort of a second question to this. My roommate and I were, oddly enough, discussing this very story,
Okay.
because he's in an Old Testament class at Harding, and so he's like, this is an odd story for where it's situated. And I was like, yeah, you're right, because within the context of the patriarchal narrative, why mention a story about some slave woman, and why paint her in a sympathetic light? That seems a little odd. What are your thoughts on that?
Good questions and good observation with the eyes too. Let me say something about the eyes first. In addition to, yes, you're right, in your eyes and seeing and all of this, you also have perhaps, because of all of that, perhaps an intentional link with the spring, like verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by the Ein Hamayim, which is, it means spring of water, but of course, Ein is ayin, is either eye or spring. And it's two different words spelled the same way. They call that a homophone, or I think they sound alike anyway. And so it perhaps just a nice narrative link. And if we read, we just keep paying attention to this, we'll see it in Genesis 22. But we even saw, like, if you look, we didn't read Genesis 3, where Eve looks and takes. And if you look at what Sarai does, she looks and she takes Hagar. And sort of there's this regular theme of trying to kind of accomplish the will of God in one's own ways, rather than waiting for the promises of God. And of course, that's true just kind of for Avram as well as Sarai, but this is kind of Sarai's story. But you just see this over and over in Genesis, and it coordinating with people looking and taking for themselves. So that's something to watch for. I think it's intentional and it's an important part of all of these stories. I love that Genesis includes Hagar's story, Ishmael's story, Esau's story, and sometimes these characters, like the very next chapter, we're going to see Avram trying to say, just take Ishmael, right? Just, continue my line through, and we've seen this already, continue my line through so-and-so, and God will say, nope, but he's making this kind of waiting game, this kind of drama, but God caring for, on the one hand, like Ishmael's description here is, he's going to have a lot of conflict in his life. He's going to be sort of like a desert wanderer. That's what like a para is, a wild ass. But God's going to still bless him. But it's not the same blessing. So it's like, I would say there is a concern for these characters, but they don't have the promise. Like the promise is only going to carry on in a certain, so there's, the Bible is regularly kind of points out characters that in sort of compassionate ways, and Esau is this way for sure. There are times where Esau is painted in a really negative light, and there are stories where Esau is the hero. Surprise, surprise. Right? This is one thing that makes these great stories, the kind of the development of some of the side characters. And certainly being an Egyptian, the narrative keeps on reminding us of Hagar's Egyptian lineage, and that's important for tying into even the Exodus. So there's lots of links with other narratives.
Well, I think it's Galatians, but they talk about the slave woman and the wife of promise and so forth, and how there's a comparison to the law and the gospel basically through that.
Yeah.
I think that's the short of it, right?
Yeah, That's
that
right.
comes
She does
back
come up there.
much
Yeah.
later,
So something you said connected with the question I had with like the like promise. I guess like when I read that sounds like a pretty negative prophecy, but everyone in the story is acting like it's really positive.
In particular, the promise of looking
Verse
for the
12.
verse 12, right? Yeah, he will be, well, that I think is negative. I don't know how Hagar is taking it. You're right that she does respond that God has like looked favorably upon her. It's a question of whether she's saying she's experienced God and lived. It's just about her experience with God, or if she's actually interpreting the message and it's like God has looked upon me favorably. And it's ambiguous, I would say. But
I think it sounds like the messenger at the end of verse 11, this is what I took from it, like the Lord saw your affliction. I guess
Yeah.
I hear that as like rewarding your affliction with this blessing. And then that, yeah. But I hadn't thought about the ambiguity of verse 13 though. So that makes sense.
Yeah, but you're right. Like God hears her. And I mean, the clear blessing of verse 10, right? That God's going to multiply your Zerah and more than can be counted. So that to me, that's a really favorable prophetic promise. Another maybe side issue, this is really a different issue, but it's curious to me that the BHS puts this in poetic form. Is this poetry? I was trying to think about like, well, what makes this poetry? Just because the BHS does it in lines doesn't necessarily mean that it's poetic. It's just, I don't really have a good answer for you, but I think if we put this within the narrative not in separate lines, if we just made it look differently, then it may not appear as poetry to you.
Kind of along.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Along a similar line, why did you translate the bait preposition in verse 12 as against? Because even if it was like with, that would just has a much more, to me, like a much more positive sound to it. But I mean, I looked it up and the NRSV has against as well.
Yeah.
And I know bait like that can mean either one.
Right. Well, it definitely can mean either one. It could be with, usually, I think the answer to this, although I would want to confirm this with more research, that a yad with a bait preposition is I think the normal idiom for a hand in being kind of outstretched against.
Oh, okay.
And so it, like anytime you see God's hand bait with a bait preposition, it's something it's usually destructive or judgmental. It's God's hands against. This is no like Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's God, where he's reaching out toward. I think that's why it gets translated that, because it's a normal way of talking about somebody being against another person.
Okay, I didn't know that. Cool.
But again, I kind of want to chase that down to confirm it. The way to do that is just to look in the lexicon and see with yod, with the bait preposition, if that, I'm sure it's there. They'll give you a bunch of occurrences where you see that. Also, Ishmael's story, this part of his name on the one hand is El hears, right? El has heard. So on the other hand, it's this guy's gonna not get along with, his descendants and so on are going to be at odds with Echav, his kin, his brothers. Good. Any other questions?
This is less a question and more an observation, just as we've been going through the Abraham story. Like, this chapter really opens up the dialogue between other characters in the story besides Abram and the Lord. So like even before with when they were in Egypt, like Sarai's words are mentioned or Lot's words are mentioned, but they don't actually have a speaking part, if you will, in the narrative. So and you were kind of talking about, Abraham endures a lot of conflict in his story. So I'm sort of paying attention, like, where does the dialogue shift with the conflict? And so far, it seems that much of the conflict is when the dialogue is between humans, and then it shifts away from the conflict part when it goes back to the focus on Abraham and God and their dialogue, especially concerning the blessing
Right.
and God's direction of Abram's life.
Yeah, good observation. I mean, Avram is a very passive character in this story, right? You have Sarai kind of orchestrating and Avram saying, whatever you say, and it's very obvious whether it's having sex with Hagar or taking on her as a wife, or letting Sarai to do oppress her. So what, she's in your hand, she's your servant. So like he is identifying, even after he gives her as an Isha, he's identifying her as a Shifcha, right? So a maidservant. You're right, though, that like God is, I don't think we've seen God visiting Sarai yet. This is God, we've seen it with Avram over and over and over, and we will continue to see that, but here Hagar gets the special visit.
You said something that took me back to Adam and Eve with Eve, when she is the main character for the little bit there interacting with the serpent. Adam is there and he's kind of like, sure, yeah, whatever you say, like, and he takes the fruit and eats it also. And this very passive character. And as you just described this chapter, Avram is very much a passive character again. And it's kind of like, yeah, sure. Whatever you say is kind of, which almost sort of suggests that both Adam knew, like, we're really not supposed to do this, but I'm going to kind of go along. And probably in this story, Avram likely also knew this really isn't the way, but I'm just going to kind of go along. Yeah. It's almost the way that came across to me. I could be wrong on that, but.
Well, yeah. And then the text, this is one of the beautiful things about these stories. It's not going to explain everything. There's a lot left up to, whenever you have like direct speech, dialogue, then as a reader, you have to evaluate that dialogue. Whereas if a narrator tells you something, then it's like you kind of have this blanket trust of the narrator, but we just don't get a lot of insight in any of these stories into kind of the internal motivations. And that's, I think, purposeful. That's just kind of narrative style of these stories. One of the side notes related to this kind of Avram's character is, like, Hagar receives the instruction to name him Yishmael, right? But then you have verse 16, and Avram, oh no, that's not what it was. Where is it? Then Avram names him, verse 15. Avram is the character. Avram names his son, the son whom Hagar bore, Yishmael. So it's maybe the fatherly duty or something. But there's some kind of communication between the two that takes place, and Avram just is acting upon Hagar's maybe story. You're right too, though. I didn't want to skip over your connection with the Eve and Adam's story. And in that case, it's not about bearing children. Like almost every story that revolves around bearing children, the men will be really passive and the women became kind of the main characters. Like Jacob and Leah, like when or Rachel and Leah. It's like they're having a competition about who can have the most children, and Jacob's just like going along with it, whatever, you know. And there's something to that kind of main character shift, and certain types of stories get elevate certain characters. This is good. I don't think I want to, like, we could start into 17, but I think I'm going to save it. Although I will just foreshadow, because I've been reading the two together this week, like, there's a lot that happens right after this that relates to Ishmael and the promise and so on, where Avram is overtly the only one talking to God. He becomes Abraham, and God changes his name, and then God will change Sarai's name, and so on. So this is what we're going to see next. But Sarai, I don't know how we evaluate their characters. Like, is Sarai just kind of a bitter and mean-spirited person? Well, I don't think the narrative does not evaluate her that way. That's where I think, like with a lot of these stories, there may be some of that, but we have to be careful not to kind of read into our own, like, we listen to how the narrative evaluates all of these characters.
And this is, my own commentary, so take it with a grain of salt. But as just a very small portion of insight into who I am in our story or whatever. Been married for 13 years and have not been able to have children. We've tried to adopt and had those fall through, and it's been kind of a painful experience. So just sort of looking at the hierarchical structure and the patriarchal structure of how the society worked at the time, whenever I consider the story of Sarai and the importance that they placed on a woman being able to bear a child, and the way she describes, I will be built up and like whatever it takes, however we have to go about this, I need to make this work. That kind of almost desperation that comes across in that, it strikes me more like somebody who is kind of wounded and hurt and is just trying to find some way to really comfort that and bind up those wounds, or at least circumvent the process, or be able to participate in the society as one who has also born children. And I think that's the image that I have always recently developed as time has gone by, and we've been through these processes where it's a different experience for women than for men in the childbearing issue. You even will see that with Samuel and Hannah, his mother, right? Her husband. It's such a man thing to say. Aren't I worth more than 10 sons to you? It's like, you don't get it, man. Come on.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
so
you're right.
That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, so that part of me is like, well, it's really different, but it really isn't in a lot of ways, right? There's, whether we think it should be this way or not, identity is often for women and sometimes for men, maybe in different things. Our identity is tied to various things, and one of those things is certainly kind of like, this is what I was born to do, have children. And so if I was born to do it, then I'm not. Also, kind of, how do what is a good life? And that's at issue here for Sarai. It's bearing a child, so that their line would be continue on. And even if maybe we wouldn't phrase it the same way in theological terms in our own experiences, I appreciate you sharing that, Dustin, because I think it does certainly relate to feelings that people have. And infertility is such a major issue in these narratives. Will?
So going off sort of this, bringing one's personal experience to this, I could see how, so to me, this is a very, enlightening, very good theological story, I think. Then the Old Testament shows a side of God that foreshadows God the Father revealed in Christ, instead of just Yahweh, the God of Israel. But I could see a woman reading this, and I'm thinking particularly of a woman who's come from an abusive relationship or who has had an experience with an
Yeah.
abusive spouse whom she has left. I happen to know quite a few people like that in my job setting. They would not like this story very much.
Right.
They'd be like, well, what the heck? Like,
Right.
God's sending this poor woman back to an abusive, or not only is she a slave and God's telling her you need to still be a slave, but she's serving a cruel master.
Right.
That would be hard to talk about with
Yes.
them.
Yeah. That's what I was talking about earlier to some degree, is like part of this really rubs me the wrong way. I mean, we know about, women who return to abusers. That's thankfully been highlighted in our kind of era. Part of it, and I don't want to minimize. I think it's important when you're reading this story not to minimize the importance of dealing with spousal abuse in our own context. I don't want to minimize that by trying to say, well, downplay the nature of the whatever onia is here, the affliction that she's experiencing. What does it mean? But it does beg the question, like in this story, what does it mean that, Hagar is actually the one who slights Sarai first. What does that mean? Looking on with contempt. Or at least Sarai feels that, because she thought this was the solution, then it turns out to be like, oh, this kind of like lowers my status. Hagar runs away from Sarai, so it must have been pretty bad. There's a lot we don't have this isn't physical abuse, but it's still evidently abusive or affliction in some way. And then for God to send her back, and it's the same word, it's the hitpael, submit yourself under your mistress. That's a bit bothersome, although it's coordinated with kind of essentially, I'm going to take care of you. So if it's just submission, that's a bit different than let yourself be afflicted by your mistress. And I think submission is what's going on here. Avram treats her like a wife, at least in the sense of listening to her story, naming the son Ishmael, caring about Ishmael, that we have that story kind of coming up, that his character is cared for by Avram. But it is a patriarchal, hierarchical. Avram's has slaves. We've heard about them before. The son of Damascus or whatever, who Avram wants is going to inherit Avram. All of these types of things. I think it is difficult to teach these stories sometimes because Will, of what you're bringing up. I think it's right to be uncomfortable with it.
I think of these things also many times as being descriptive of what happened as opposed to prescriptive of what we should do.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important difference, so that we don't talk to somebody about scripture and they go, yeah, but it not condemns, but supports or whatever these, and that's not necessarily what's happening here. It's not a proponent of this. It's just saying this is what happened, more than it is saying God designed it to be this way and we should do this today.
Yeah.
It oftentimes is pointing out all the brokenness and the damaged people that are involved. And honestly, I appreciate that, particularly when you come to the New Testament and Jesus comes with grace and truth. And it's like we have the brokenness of people, and it's all through the Old Testament, and he came to redeem them anyway. So there's some beauty in the brokenness being made right, but not necessarily fixed, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I agree that for the most part, these are really the goal of these are to describe, and there is a lot of brokenness and God kind of persevering with making good on his promises in spite of it. The difficulty is with, in particular, I think the most troubling spot is when Yahweh is involved with sending her back. And so God, this is where Will's point is like, now we're dealing with God's character. But I think we ought to be open to God maneuvering ultimately in some ways that might not seem godlike to us in order to see his promise through. And I want to be really hesitant to, part of me wants to say, well, God, this is probably better for Hagar in the long run. Maybe God's kind of taking care of her through this, but I also want to be really careful not to, especially with people who would find this offensive, to not try to clear God's name too quickly. We're going to see, we need to be thinking about God's character, I think, throughout these, what does it say about who God is? That's the right question to be asking with all of these stories. Well, very good. Any other final comments or reflections? We're about our Hebrew story hour is about finished here, but if you have any parting words, now is the time. I think next week we will probably just do chapter 17. 18 is kind of long, so 17 is less interesting, but it's usually, to me anyway, maybe it won't be to you, but we have all sorts of language about circumcision and so on. So if you want to read ahead, you'll get to know the language of circumcision in chapter 17, but it's about the blessing in another covenant text. All right. Well, thank you all for your attendance. Spread the word to other potentially interested people. And I will be back, whether I advertise it or not. I'll be back next Wednesday. Please join me. Shalom lachem.
Shalom. Take care. Thanks for doing this. This was great.
Yeah, glad you're